Don't pressure me.
Then Jim and Isaac and I can't have a conversation about the latest Easter eggs in Mandalorian, but we'll talk about that later because this is the In the Tank podcast, episode 270. Going to be talking about the Great Reset. It's finally trending, folks. We've been talking about it for months, and it's finally hitting the mainstream. So we're going to dedicate pretty much the majority of this episode to that very important topic. And as always, I am your host, Donald Kendal. Joining me today, I've got Justin Haskins, editorial director at the Heartland Institute. How are you, good sir?
I'm doing very well. I want to take this moment to just give a brief update. As many of you know who have been listening and watching this show for quite some time, that there has been for at least a year now an insidious attack that has been going on my character and on my Twitter account. And we've fought back. We've beat those people back over and over and over again. We've triumphed. And now we've been rewarded because the socialist forces at Twitter are just too much to deal with. We've now also gone over to Parler, and Parler, in their infinite wisdom, has decided that they will be giving me a gold badge, which is just like a blue badge, except it's gold, which is automatically better. And so the Unfollow Justin movement has not only crashed and burned, it has crashed and burned in such a spectacular fashion. I'm now being rewarded and given more followers.
Isaac Orr, research fellow at the Center of the American Experiment, as leader of the Unfollow Justin campaign. How do you react to news like that?
You know, I thought the Unfollow Justin bit was stale like 6 months ago, which is why I've kind of abandoned it. So congratulations, Justin.
Okay, wow. Very gracious in defeat. Jim Likely, VP of the Heartland Institute. How are you, good sir?
I'm doing fine. This is the first week of me cutting the cord. I am done with ESPN and Fox News and cable altogether. It's been a lot of fun. And I recommend The Undoing, which is a new miniseries on HBO starring Nicole Kidman and Hugh Grant. It's actually a little discovery that I made this past weekend. It's been a lot of fun.
Liberal?
No, I don't. But
you just got to cut entertainment out of your no TV week forever.
No TV week.
Well, Jim,
I'll consider it.
Jim couldn't follow through with his boycott of the NFL because his team is actually doing well this year.
It's easy to boycott when your team sucks.
Right.
Yeah, unfortunately, I'm a Steelers fan, so boycotting is pretty much out of the question.
All right, so like I said, I want to talk about the Great Reset for the majority of this episode here. If you're not aware of what the Great Reset is, you should check all the content that we have over on stoppingsocialism.com. You can also see videos that we've talked about this subject on Stopping Socialism TV on YouTube. But before we get into that, let's go back a little bit. Let's go back in history. Like maybe, I don't know, year and a half, when we first started doing the In the Tank podcast with just Isaac and Justin and I. And there's a thing coming out called the Green New Deal. And we had a discussion during an episode of the podcast where we're like, the Green New Deal is so crazy, so expensive, it's so socialist that, like, is it even worth talking about? Is it even worth talking about? And I remember Isaac said, no, let's not even give this thing any attention. It's going to fade away. Nobody cares about the Green New Deal. Like, let's not even talk about it. And then fast forward a couple of months, and it was the only thing anyone could talk about for a while. So, Isaac, are you going to be gracious in defeat when it comes to that, too?
Well, I mean, Honey Boo Boo was a thing, so I should have known better than to think that something that is so stupid that should never get any legs got a lot of legs.
Yeah. And Justin,
Taco Bell voted best Mexican food restaurant in 2018. I rest my case. I'm done. I am done underestimating the stupidity of people.
Justin, as the person that has been deemed the arch rival, I think is that the term of the Green New Deal?
He gave himself that nickname. You can't give yourself a nickname.
He did not. It was from some organization. Well, who was it?
It was an organization called Common Dreams, and I believe it was Arch Enemy. But okay, I could be wrong. It could be Arch Rival. I'd have to look it up.
This is Justin's burner account on Twitter.
Yeah,
it's not. It's not an account on Twitter. It's an article. It's in an article, Isaac. It is on the internet. It's in an article. That means it's true. That means it's true automatically.
Arch Enemy. It's like you're the Riddler or something. It's like they really take it seriously.
Yeah, right.
Arch Enemy. It's Arch Enemy. I've confirmed it. Yep.
Yeah, who's right. The venom of the global warming alarmist crowd. So I mean, I bring this up because obviously the Green New Deal was this big thing. Everyone talked about it. The forces of good were able to demonize it enough and basically smear it so much that it almost became toxic, and politicians started having to run away from it. Right. I think Joe Biden, the perfect example of that, was during one of the presidential debates where he was like, "No, I didn't support the Green New Deal." So it's like, the presidential candidate for the left tried to distance himself from it. So the same thing I think is starting to happen with the Great Reset, because the Great Reset was this concept that Justin and I started talking about months ago. And now it's finally starting to get into the limelight here and starting to get the attention that we've been saying it deserves. And obviously our intention is not to bring it more exposure in a good way, but is to bring it more exposure so that people can treat it the same way as the Green New Deal and get it to be toxic enough where the people that are pushing it have to kind of step back from it. So that's kind of the plan with all of this. I think it worked with the Green New Deal, even though I think that's far from being dead. But that's our goal with all of this. So the reason why the Great Reset kind of jumped back into the limelight here is because of our friend up north in Canada, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. He had I think it was like a digital conference, World Economic Forum, UN, I think. It was like a UN digital conference thing. And he brought up the idea of the Great Reset. So we do have the clip here. If you've got it all set, Andy, we could play, I think the best nickname I've heard for Justin Trudeau is Prime Minister Zoolander. He's like the dopiest politician out there. But here's him talking about the Great Reset.
Across the world and across sectors is essential. This pandemic has provided an opportunity for a reset. This is our chance to accelerate our pre-pandemic efforts to reimagine economic systems that actually address global challenges like extreme poverty, inequality, and climate change. Last week, our government committed to investing more in international development while supporting developing countries on their economic recoveries and resilience.
All right, I can't even listen to
on that note, today... That
was the best part of it anyways. The pandemic has provided the opportunity for a reset. If you go back further into his clip, which I'm not going to ask you to do, Andy, he uses a lot of the same terminology that we'll talk about. A lot of these great resetter people talk about. He says the pandemic has laid bare the inequities and gaps in our society that have to be addressed. Yada 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 yada. But one of the big consistencies throughout all of these calls for the Great Reset is using COVID-19 as justification. So, Jim, we're both in the state of Illinois that has just taken a step back and gone into further lockdown. So, I mean, just talk about this idea of COVID-19 being used as justification for all types of terrible stuff.
Well, yeah, I mean, the Great Reset's using COVID on a global scale to institute global governance, with the world of nations and all of that. And Justin will get into that a little bit more of that as we move along in the podcast, as will all of us. But here in Illinois, yeah, we get to see it as in the micro sense, in a microcosm, in that, we just went back to tier 3 starting on Friday. That means, basically it's not quite to the point where COVID is justifying the closing down of all quote unquote non-essential businesses. I think hair salons will still be open with a few more restrictions on them, but indoor eating at restaurants, that's done now. For instance, at my health club, basically the locker rooms are now closed. If you are able to play tennis, you have to wear a mask while playing tennis. re-inhaling your own exhaling of carbon dioxide through a mask while playing tennis is probably a pretty big, I think for a lot of people, is a much more hazardous activity than actually playing without a mask on a tennis court. But, these are the arbitrary decisions that are made without any debate, without any science backing it up, because there was just that new study from Denmark that showed that there is no statistical difference whatsoever between wearing a mask and not wearing a mask. That, as we have said, and common sense has said for a long time, if you are symptomatic, if you have COVID, a mask can help prevent you from giving it to somebody else. But the idea of a mask as a prophylactic against you getting COVID is not true. Yeah, I knew you'd like that word. I knew you'd love that word. But this is so people are this. We've said this for a long time that COVID has been the perfect opportunity. And there's a great post at stoppingsocialism.com that has the 30 of the craziest quotes supporting the Great Reset. And is that they all see, from, Commissar Pritzker, who's our governor here in Illinois, to Klaus Schwab and the others at the UN, who see COVID as an excuse to implement more control over the citizenry. All of this is not about safety. It's not about science. It's not about health. It's about control. And so this was all a test. And I said months ago, when this first started in March, that I didn't expect the American people to basically lay down and take it with almost no pushback. But that is what we've had. And the command and control leaders of the planet could not have even predicted that it would be this easy to gin up an excuse to control everything in somebody's life. The CDC just today, just before we started recording this podcast, advised officially from the government that you should not travel anywhere for Thanksgiving. So that's what our government is telling us now. We have governors in California and governors all across this country telling people how many people they can have in their home. And people are pretty much just lying down and taking it. In fact, the idea that you could even suggest to regulate your activity in your own home, which is supposed to be your castle in a free society, and it's happening everywhere. And none of these things that the leaders of the Great Reset and the pushers of the Great Reset globally are none of it has anything to do with protecting our freedom, with protecting and advancing liberty. It's always control. It's always treating us like children, and it's treating us as subjects, not citizens. And I am not going to stand down for that. I'm not going to just lay down and get run over. But it seems like, sadly, a majority of people around the United States and maybe around the world are willing to be treated as subjects and not free people and not citizens.
Well, it really seems like COVID-19 has really kind of opened the door for these controls. And a lot of these controls are things that they've been talking about forever. And they've been trying to use climate change as justification for all of these things.
And it didn't work before. Climate change wasn't good enough. So now this is good enough.
Right. Didn't work. I mean, how many polls show that people cared about climate change next to last when it came to issues politically? Or how many polls that show that people wouldn't be willing to pay $3.50 extra a month if that meant cutting back on climate change? Nobody cared. It was climate change, or COVID-19, that bust down that door and just allowed for just basically anything. I mean, we could talk about some of the examples in different states like Michigan or even Illinois. I mean, you already talked about all of these places being locked down. The idea that you're not going to get COVID if you're eating in a enclosed tent outside, but you will get it if you're inside the restaurant is just insane to me. I saw an article, this was in the New York Post, new coronavirus lockdown in Greece requires people to text authorities before leaving their home. It just basically allows the government to basically do whatever they want. If as long as they say science enough and COVID-19, they can do whatever they want, and it's absolutely frightening. But so let's go back a little bit. I want to actually kind of talk about the Great Reset and kind of, for those people that are a little bit less familiar with it. But go back a little bit. So in, I think, May, Justin calls me, and this is when we're in the midst of the first lockdown. God, we're in the midst of the first lockdown. He calls me and he's like, yeah, do you hear anything about this Great Reset thing? I said, no. He's like, yeah, so I started looking into it. I'm paraphrasing you, Justin. Sorry for this. But
I'm a lot more eloquent.
Shrill enough.
No, that's not it. It's the eloquence. I'm usually much more eloquent than that.
So he starts reading me these quotes. And a lot of these quotes are in this article that Jim already mentioned, 30 of the craziest quotes supporting the anti-capitalist Great Reset by world leaders that you can find at stoppingsocialism.com. But some of them, I won't read them all off, but this global pandemic has also demonstrated again how interconnected we are. We have to restore a functioning system of smart global cooperation structured to address the challenges of the next 50 years. The Great Reset will require us to integrate all stakeholders of global society into a community of common interests, purpose, and action. So that's Klaus Schwab, who is not a James Bond villain. He is the executive chairman of the World Economic Forum. Here's another quote. As we move from rescue to recovery, we have a unique and rapidly shrinking window of opportunity to learn lessons and reset ourselves on a more sustainable path. It is an opportunity we have never had before and may never have again. That was Prince Charles of the UK. John Kerry, this is a big moment. The World Economic Forum is really going to have to play a front and center role in refining the Great Reset to deal with climate change and inequity, all which is laid bare as consequence of COVID-19. Al Gore, during a NBC Morning in America or something like that, this is the time for a great reset. And there's quote after quote after quote, people from the UN, people from Greenpeace, all talking about this concept of a reset. So that's kind of what sparked our concern, our suspicions, I guess. Like, what are they all like? What's the playbook that they're all reading from? What is this great reset? So we started looking into it, and what we found is that it goes far beyond sloganeering and talking points. But the World Economic Forum and other interested parties have a really well fleshed out plan of what this great reset is. So, Justin, you wrote the article in The Hill titled Introducing the Great Reset, World Leaders' Radical Plan to Transform the Economy, which came out in June, several months ago, that kind of laid out these this ground level here. So yeah, tell us about the Great Reset.
Right. So as Donnie mentioned there's every major international institution that you can think of practically. Many of the biggest world leaders, most influential world leaders, many of the biggest corporations are all on board with this Great Reset. International Monetary Fund, World Economic Forum, the head of the United Nations, the World Bank, Bank of China, Bank of America, BP, MasterCard, a whole bunch of other people, Microsoft, all have been involved in this. They've all endorsed it in some fashion or another. And it essentially boils down to two main plans, I would say. The first main plan is they have all of these different social programs that you would normally think of as being your Bernie Sanders, AOC, far left-wing, progressive social programs. You've got federal jobs guarantees. You've got all kinds of, living wage mandates and things like that. You have the Green New Deal, not just in America, but in Europe and in elsewhere around the world. You've got much higher taxes. You've got redistribution of wealth between nations. All your typical crazy left-wing stuff is all in there. That's one part of it. All right. And then, but on a global scale, then on the other part of it is they want to take because that's not enough. Just having a Green New Deal, having federal jobs guarantee, all these, things that some people say will cost $100 trillion or more. Like, that's not enough. In addition to all of that, what the world leaders want to do is they also want to completely reform the way that we think of business and capitalism. And from their perspective, our existing system, which they call shareholder capitalism, as sort of a derogatory term, means that businesses make decisions in line with what their shareholders and customers want. Now, shareholders means, of course, the owners of the company. And now they think this is really bad because sometimes companies make decisions that might be good for shareholders and customers, but they are not good for society. That's what they would say. So instead, we have to move away from a model that focuses on what owners of businesses want, what customers of those businesses want, and instead focus on a stakeholder system. Stakeholder just means collective, what the collective wants. So For example, fossil fuel companies, really terrible for the world, according to the people who support the Great Reset, because they're causing climate change to happen. So some fossil fuel company might make decisions that are good for the shareholders and good for their customers and good for people who like affordable energy, but it's bad for the planet. So what they're going to do
for the worthless people who are part of the World Economic Forum, like Prince Charles. The guy's never done anything productive in his entire life. And he gets to make decisions for the rest of us?
That's right.
Guy Fawkes, baby. Guy Fawkes.
That's right. Thank you,
Blow
Isaac.
it all up.
No, you're 100%
November
right.
5th already passed, man.
The whole
we'll make it November 25th this year.
Yeah, get on that, Isaac. Why don't you start with
Deal.
that? That's a good project for the Center of the Americas. So
Policy fellow specializing in Guy Fawkes-esque celebrations.
Yeah, the Guy Fawkes Center for Social Change.
Social justice.
Right. So essentially what they want to do is they want to build a whole infrastructure called ESG Standards. It's environmental, social, and governance standards. And the idea behind this is that you would have a organized, systemic way of evaluating businesses and whether those businesses are actually doing things that are good for the collective. And so they have all these measurements that they use to help come up with a score. It's sort of like a social credit score system for those of you who know what that is, but except for businesses. So what they'll do is they'll look at the board of directors of a company and they'll say, do you have enough women? Are there enough minorities? They'll look at how many people you employ. Are you paying people enough money? How much fossil fuels are you burning? How many is the air quality in your supply chain high enough? All sorts of leftist goals built into this ESG standard system that they can evaluate companies and spit out a score and decide who the good companies are and who the bad companies are, and then direct government funds and regulations and all sorts of other things to reward the companies that are pursuing left-wing causes and punish the companies that are not pursuing left-wing causes.
Yeah, no, and this is probably the most important part of all of this. I mean, like the first part of it that you were talking about, the jobs guarantees, the universal health care, and the whole list that you went through. I mean, like, we've talked about that a million times. Obviously, that's just fraught with problems. But this is kind of the new part of it, right? This whole ESG standards. And we did an episode on this. I forget which episode it was. I'll try to find it and put it in the show notes. But we really went in depth into these ESG standards, the environmental, social, and governance standards. And like you said, it boils down to like a Chinese social credit score for businesses that rewards or punishes firms based on dozens, or if not hundreds, of metrics that are spread across 4 different pillars. Governance, or like how the company is governed. The planet, how your company, hurts or helps the planet. People, and prosperity. And so some of these metrics include, as you were talking about, greenhouse gas emissions, ecological sensitivity of the supply chain, executive positions held by women and underrepresented social groups, gender pay equality, diversity and inclusion, community investment, water usage. It's just like a million other factors that have to be somehow tracked, quantified, and reported to some centralized bureaucracy so that they can determine what your score is according to these ESG standards. So instead of a business being rewarded by how good and efficiently they provide goods and services to the individual, now it's a system where businesses are punished or rewarded based on some algorithm that's put together by some elites sitting in some like AOC type elites sitting in the United Nations and the World Economic Forum. So it really just takes the power away from the individual and puts it in this. I would say collective, but I think that's being too generous, because I don't think Isaac Orr has any say in what this collective algorithm is.
Guy Fawkes this stuff.
No, it's
that's
people
the
like
only recourse that normal people have.
It's people like Prince Charles and Klaus Schwab that get to decide. I mean,
worthless people.
I mean, Justin, am I overstating things here?
No, I think it is important to understand that for a long time, I sort of thought of it, and Donnie too, when we would talk about this, we would talk about it almost as this is a socialism. This is a form of socialism. And in a way it is, because it effectively collectivizes the decision-making for companies. It forces companies to think about things completely differently. They're putting the collective first, not customers, not markets, not any of that stuff. Companies get rewarded using, public funds. So there's a collectivist angle to that. Plus you have all these social programs that are socialist programs, right? Like Green New Deal, et cetera. So at first we looked at this as being sort of a socialist thing, but in a way I almost see this now as less of a socialist thing and more of just like an authoritarian thing.
Sure.
It's a soft authoritarianism. It's not, jackboot stormtrooper. Yeah, but it's a form of authoritarianism. It's centralized control of as much of society as they possibly can control. And then when you start adding to this all of the things that they're saying about changing the currency, adding a digital currency, having a global digital currency that will displace the dollar. We're going to get rid of that. Instead, we're going to have these elites controlling the currency. And then we're going to give people sort of a government bank accounts. And then we'll be able to put digital currency in those government bank accounts in a recession if we want to just give an infusion of cash to everybody in society. When you start thinking through all these things logically and you start sort of projecting out what this universe would look like if we actually had all of these policies in place, you realize the people at the top would be in control of everything.
Right.
And you might have elections still and all of that, but ultimately those elections would just put more of those, you put more of those people in place, just like we have here in the United States, where we have elections, yeah, but we have this big, gigantic, massive bureaucratic system that really is the one pulling the levers on a day-to-day basis in Washington, D.C. And it's terrible and it's awful and it's a broken system. It's that on a global scale, but then pumped with steroids. It's a horrible, horrible system.
Yeah. So,
but yeah, is it socialistic? It has socialistic elements, but I would argue it's more driven by sort of the elites wanting to control everything than it is anything else.
Well, Jim, I want to put your imagination to the test here because, we talk about this ESG standards, right? And we can go through the list of all the things that are supposed to be taken into account to show how globally responsible your corporation is so that you could be punished or rewarded accordingly. But I was just thinking, there's no constitution that's setting these ESG standards and metrics, in stone, right? They can be changed at any given Davos meeting, right? So, what's stopping them from having some type of punishment or reward based on free speech? Should Facebook and social media outlets be docked points, if they're not sufficiently squashing down hate speech or conspiracy theories? Or what if the next Davos meeting they decide to have a metric about docking points for companies that are too associated with firearm industry and manufacturers? Suddenly you're going to have credit card companies and banks being pressured to cut off business with buying firearms or even allowing that on your credit card or anything like that. So, those are two of the scarier ones that I can think of.
Well, who buys firearms not with cash anyway? What kind of world are you living in, Donald?
That's a good point. Usually the guy in the alleyway only takes cash. So,
well, this is where, as Justin was speaking about, changing the Great Reset, aiming to change capitalism into what's not capitalism anymore, which capitalism is there to serve the public, its customers, and its shareholders, into something else, in which capitalism is destroyed really and replaced with something that advances social justice or whatever else they want to do with it. And it is authoritarian. It's not simply just socialism. It's not soft socialism. And I would say that the only thing keeping it from being a hard authoritarianism is that they have not decided to take up arms, these government elites, to force people to do what they say. But that's the logical endpoint to what we have here. But the United States, we still do have the Constitution of the United States, which is supposed to be there to protect us from schemes like this. Our founding fathers bequeath to us a government that is supposed to respond and only act with the consent of the governed. Nobody in the United States is going to consent to the Great Reset. Nobody in the United States knows who the hell Klaus Schwab is. And I would think that less than 0.1% of Americans have even heard of the World Economic Forum. Yet these people are meeting in, it's actually amazing that they're so overt about it. These are the kind of things that they've been talking about in secret for years. Klaus Schwab wrote a book, I think it was 30 years ago, about basically what we're at now, which is the Great Reset, and to reform capitalism, which means destroy it. And with capitalism comes freedom. In the United States, we still, elections matter less than they used to, maybe a couple generations ago, because the administrative state is so large that it governs our life and it makes the decisions for us a lot more than we do.
That makes the elections even more important, because
whoever's
in charge of the administrative state is, that's the whole problem, right?
Yeah.
Like Biden wouldn't be able to do whatever he wants with energy policy if we didn't have such a huge bureaucracy. So like this all just gets worse over time. How uplifting of a message.
It does. But I think it will come to a point where free people here in the United States are not going to put up with it. And it starts with asking questions, very basic questions. What gives you the right? What gives you the right to impose these policies on the United States? Nobody consented to this. And people have to start asking those questions and start talking about this and start confronting what the plans are from these unaccountable global elites that want to change the way the United States operates. It goes back, to the climate change stuff with the Paris Accord. We have to do these things, but other countries don't. And nobody assigned to this. It wasn't a treaty. No one in Congress, no one in the Senate approved the treaty of the Paris Climate Accord. Yet we were supposed to, the last couple of years under Obama, we tried to implement it. And of course, we actually did better in meeting the goals of Paris, if you care about that stuff, after we left under President Trump. But you have to start asking, what gives you the right to, even in the United States, if this starts happening, if we start instituting a social justice type of capitalism, what gives you the right to change the relationship fundamentally between the shareholders and the corporations they invest in? You don't have the right to do that. And there needs to be constitutional challenges in this country to even the smallest steps in this direction. That's the way this gets stopped ultimately, is here in the United States, because you cannot count on any country in the European Union, not even our friends in Great Britain, to push back on this. Certainly Canada's already gone. Prime Minister Zoolander is all for it. But here in the United States, we have to stand up. We have to talk to our elected representatives while they still have the time and still have the power to push back on this stuff by saying, you do not have the right on the Constitution to implement any of this on the people of the United States.
Yeah, you say, what gives you the right? And I think that their answer would be, COVID-19 pandemic. We have to make sure that 0.01% of our population worldwide doesn't succumb to this absolutely terrible disease. And kind of like what I said about, that was, they tried to use climate change for a while to kind of bash down that door of all of these authoritarian type practices, and it didn't work. So they instead used COVID-19 as a very successful battering ram to bash open that door. Well, I think that was successful in bashing open that door, but what I think will be used in the long term to keep that door open is definitely climate change alarmism. And I know, Justin, you and I are on the same page on that. Like that definitely.
I don't think that's going to work, though.
Go ahead. Why?
Because it's always at the bottom of everybody's list. Like right now, nobody cared about climate change during the last election, not even Democrats. And they cared the most. So Democrats and independents, Republicans and independents, I don't ever think that they're going to be so worried about this that they're going to be able to do this for climate change. Prove me wrong.
Well, no, I think that, so like the concept of like a temporary tax or something like that, like once you get it in the door, it's like impossible to get rid of, right? So I think that the justification to keep something in place doesn't have to be as strong as the original justification. So once that door is bashed down.
We've already seen yellow vest stuff happen in places where they try to do this, right? So like unlike COVID, where people see like their family members pass away, like my grandma just passed away from it, but she's 99, right? So like we were hoping 99? To get to 100. Yeah, wow. 2 months away from 100.
Wow.
So like people see that and they get more freaked out, or there's more like immediate harm to them. But for climate change, no, like people see the economic destruction that these policies cause, and that causes them to want to burn stuff, which very Guy Fawkesian. So
it all comes back.
It all comes back. And like, I just feel like our job is to educate people about why all this stuff is for no good reason. And if that makes them take to the streets a little sooner, then man, we did our job.
Hey, Isaac, I'm not, I don't disagree with you, really. I mean, I think that this is definitely going to be their attempt at the very least. They're going to try to use climate change as justification to keep all of these things in place that they're trying to get set up during this COVID-19 thing. I'm not necessarily sure that it'll work, and I hope that it won't work and that we can get enough people to put on their yellow vests and push back against all this crap.
Mostly peaceful protesting, Donald. That's what'll get the job done.
Go ahead, Justin. You seem like you want to jump in.
Well, I just think a couple things. Number one is, in America, there's no question that, climate change is not a valid justification for blowing up the economy. Like, that's just not it. The American people have made that very clear. They're not interested in that. However, I would caution people to be a little less optimistic about that continuing to be the case forever if we don't, do a successful job of pushing back against it. Because if you look at other parts of the world, it is viewed as a valid justification for blowing up economies. And they are willing to live with the consequences of that in many parts of the world. And they've done that. They've made horrible economic choices based on this idea that we're all going to die from climate change if we don't, go to wind power. And so it has worked in some other parts of the country. When you look at polls, if you look at polling data that they've done globally, there are certain parts of the world where more than 50% of the people believe that humanity won't survive because of climate change, that humanity will eventually be wiped out because of climate change. It's not the case in America, but in other parts of the world, that is the case. Certain parts of Europe, people believe that. I think, Donnie, do you remember that poll that we looked at from the Philippines? They asked people in the Philippines about climate change. It was like 70% believed that humanity was going to be wiped out because of climate change. 70%. So people do believe this in some parts of the world. And that's why the left keeps trying. They're going to keep trying forever because it's the perfect justification for everything that they always wanted to do.
Well, right, because it's not falsifiable. Like for the people that say they care about science, like, oh, well, climate change caused it to get warmer or colder, but we can't tell you which one or why.
Exactly. And they could be wrong and then just say, well, we'll get it. We're working. The models are better. The models that predict something 20 years in the future, they're better than the ones that we had 20 years ago. They can always say that. And so it'll always be so all they have to do is keep banging this drum long enough. If the media continues to go along with it, I think they hope eventually people will catch on to it. And I am on the fence as to whether that will actually happen here in the US. I don't know. I'm not as convinced that my generation, when they're 50 years old, won't be willing to sign on to all of this to save the planet. I'm not so convinced that my generation is also going to reject all of this purely on economic grounds. And the other thing that you have to keep in mind is that everything that Isaac said is premised on the idea that people will believe this is bad for the economy. But what you have to understand is that the whole premise of the Great Reset is we're going to make sure it's not bad for the economy because we're going to pump so much cash into these economies in order to make this stuff happen. They're going to invent it. They're going to print it, basically, that it won't be bad for you. You're actually going to be better off economically with these policies too. So they're trying to convince people that even the economics make sense if you go this route. Now that's a ludicrous argument, but if that argument is repeated by enough people, it becomes the reality in the same way that all of these people believe that, we should keep kids out of schools, even though every public health expert in the world practically is saying you shouldn't keep kids out of schools because of COVID. It doesn't matter anymore. That became the talking point and people accepted it at some point. So they're not going to give up. And I do think they have a shot of being successful. It depends entirely on how good people like we are at stopping it, basically.
Yeah, and that's where the modern monetary theory thing jumps in, because that's another thing that we've been kind of sounding the alarms on for a while. And these systems don't really work, right? They fly in the face of any, in any economic sense, right? It flies in the face of any of that. But if you put it all under the guise of modern monetary theory, where debt and deficits don't matter, we could print as much money as we want and just pour it into whatever industries that we think would be beneficial for the world with no real consequences, then it starts to work, right? Obviously, that's a fatally flawed system too, and I don't think that it'll actually work, but that's what they're telling us here. So how does this seep into the United States? Right, because it seems like, if we had a totally free market loving president and Congress, that's going to stop any of this from really being able to happen in the United States. So how does it seep into the U.S., Justin?
Well, I think it depends a lot on what ends up happening with these Senate seats in Georgia. If the Democrats win those 2 Senate seats in Georgia and they take over control of the Senate, then I think that the way that they will go about this is in a much more direct fashion. They actually can pass legislation that will do some of the things that we're talking about. They will say that they need to have a Green New Deal and that to save the planet, they have to do it. And the far left-wing base of the party will essentially drag them into going in that direction. If that doesn't work, I think they're going to add states. I think they're going to pack the Supreme Court. So all of the arguments that Jim was making earlier will be irrelevant because they could have 4 more Supreme Court justices on there tomorrow. They're all left-wing people that rubber stamp everything that they want to do anyway. It will totally change the direction of the country. The Senate will never, conservatives will never win the Senate again if they add 2 states and 4 senators overnight. I mean, we may never win the Senate again.
Mm-hmm.
So
Justin, what's the mechanism for adding states?
The mechanism for adding states, you have to, it depends on whether you're carving a state out of an existing state or you're adding a territory.
Right.
If you're adding a territory as a state, like what they want to do in the case of Puerto Rico, for example, all you need is Puerto Rico to agree to it, which they've already done in a couple of different votes. And then you would need Congress to essentially pass a law that makes them a state and adds them in. If you're trying to carve a state out of an existing state, then you need the state to agree to give up that land. And then you also need Congress to approve it. But that's all you need. It's just essentially a simple majority from Congress in order to create a state. So you need it from both houses, but you do need it, just a simple majority. So it would not be hard to create a state. If you had control of the Senate, you could make it's harder to do if you're trying to carve it out of an existing state, because now you got to get those people to agree too. But in the case of Washington, D.C. and Puerto Rico, that's not an issue. So it would not be hard to do.
Trump should have annexed Alberta.
Yeah, you should have followed your lead.
Yeah. I think that if Canada was willing to give it up, it would make sense to take it. I think it's also foolish to be, if we're just thinking strategically here about this, we have these massive, massive states out west, huge states. Why do we have these gigantic states out west and these tiny states on the East Coast?
Quite a tangent. Let's
Well, it's not going to be if they add 4 more senators to the Senate, and conservatives need to find a way to make new states in order to offset that.
Trump should have bought Greenland when he had the chance. That solves all the problems.
He should have just told them that he was taking Greenland.
I don't know about you, but I'm not sure that they seem like Democrats to me. I don't know.
I don't know.
I'd be
repopulated.
As long as it's not Iceland and they have to go up against our Mighty Ducks or anything like that.
Yeah, they're good at hockey, man.
So one of the concerns I think that people looking at the 2020 election is how radical really is Joe Biden, right? So he tried to really distance himself as being a socialist. He tried to paint himself as being more of a moderate, right? But then back when Justin and I were first talking about all of this stuff, we found a clip of Joe Biden talking about his Build Back Better plan. Andy, do you have this clip queued up? I don't know if it's got the best audio, so I might just have to transcribe some of what he has to say here. But this is him on the campaign talking about his Build Back Better plan. Go ahead and hit play.
Income tax will be over. Let's make sure the workers have the power and the voice. It's way past time to put an end to the era of shareholder capitalism. The only responsibility a corporation has is the shareholder.
Okay, just go ahead. Stop it on the cough. I mean,
They have
that's,
responsibility to their workers.
Shareholders.
Chokes on that word.
Do a radical motion.
yeah, go ahead and stop
These
it.
are
It's fine.
basic values.
Yeah, we don't need to hear this,
So,
Andy.
so Bill,
Shut this guy up.
So Build Back Better, the Build Back Better plan, and the idea of shareholder capitalism. These are two pieces of verbiage that you find throughout World Economic Forum literature. So this is kind of what really tipped us off here. If you go and scour the World Economic Forum website, you'll find a bunch of articles. Building Back Better. Here's how you can navigate the risks we face after COVID-19. Another one, to build back better, we must reinvent capitalism. Here's how. And if you look back, you can actually find this Build Back Better plan has been used by politicians in different countries through like years. So that was kind of what tipped us off, that Joe Biden might actually be on the take for this Great Reset plan. But Justin, you did a lot more digging, and you found that Biden had numerous ties to the World Economic Forum, the concept of the Great Reset.
Yeah, there's a whole bunch of things that we could go into. Some of it is very circumstantial. Some of it is a little bit more clear. But maybe the most important connection is that Joe Biden, who has been involved with the World Economic Forum for many years, he's given keynote speeches. He's met with Klaus Schwab. He knows all those people very intimately. He is very, very close to John Kerry. The Kerry family and the Biden family are very close to each other. John Kerry is an open supporter of the Great Reset. He's given interviews with the World Economic Forum within the past year, talking about the Great Reset, saying how great it is, how we need to have it. And John Kerry isn't just friends with Joe Biden. He's part of Biden's, he's going to be part of Biden's cabinet more likely than not. He served with Joe Biden when they were in the Obama administration together. Kerry was on Biden's unity task forces that he and Bernie Sanders put together. He was the co-chair, John Kerry was, of the climate change unity task force with AOC. People expect that John Kerry will either be Secretary of State or climate czar or something like that within the Joe Biden cabinet. So there's a very clear connection there. Joe Biden has lots of connections to board members at the World Economic Forum, which is the biggest supporter of the Great Reset. For example, Al Gore sits on the board. There are big time investors, billionaires that sit on the board that Joe Biden has close connections to. The head of BlackRock, for example, the Carlyle Group, all connections to Joe Biden. One of the CEO of Salesforce, who's also I believe a billionaire or very, very wealthy person, hundreds of millions of dollars at minimum. He's on the board of directors of the World Economic Forum, and he's very closely tied to Kamala Harris, has been supporting Kamala Harris ever since she was running for local office many years ago in California and San Francisco. So really close ties there. Joe Biden created, most people don't know this, but Joe Biden started the Biden Institute. Most people have never heard of this, at the University of Delaware. And
Listen, Jack. Come on, man.
And when he created the Biden Institute,
that's the slogan for the Biden Institutes. Come on, man.
Come on, man.
When he created the Biden Institute a few years back, and this is, you can still find this article, as far as I know, on the University of Delaware's website. It says that Joe Biden consulted Klaus Schwab at the World Economic Forum to find out how he could make the Biden Institute similar to the World Economic Forum, but an American version of it, where they would have these big conferences like Davos, but in America. And this would all be centered around this Biden Institute that no one's heard of. So pretty incredible just there in and of itself. So we talked about the Build Back Better thing. There's that connection as well. There's so many details to this, so many people that surround Joe Biden who have been linked to the World Economic Forum. The list goes on and on and on. It seems obvious that there is a very clear connection. And if you just read the things that Joe Biden has on his transition website, for instance, his presidential transition website is buildbackbetter.com. Mm-hmm. And on the website, he uses it's almost as though he copied and pasted it from the World Economic Forum website. In the climate change section, for example, where he talks about things like how COVID-19 is this opportunity that we have to build a whole new economy, and all of the stuff that that sounds eerily similar to things that you'll find on the World Economic Forum's website. So
can we get to that? Because their 8 predictions for the world in 2030 was like the dumbest thing I'd ever heard. And I'd like to, for us all to comment on it.
Yeah. One other just weird thing that I want to point out, and maybe somebody would like hear this up front and think like, oh, this seems like an inconsistency. But, Justin, you talked about BP, MasterCard, Microsoft, and a number of other like big companies that seem to be like totally on board with this World Economic Forum Great Reset plan. And it's just like, well, if they're trying to shift it from capitalism to this kind of authoritarian 21st century socialism type of system, like why would these very capitalist companies be on board with that, right? And so when you were back, and this is another testament to the fact that we've been on this Great Reset thing for a while, when you were on Glenn Beck's show in June, introducing him to the idea of the Great Reset, he talked about this, and he said, like, these companies being on board, and he talked about this like a George Soros type guy came and met with one of his guys and told him that, like, you've got to stop this anti-globalist rhetoric that Glenn Beck is spouting, because like the ship has already left and you're either on the ship or you're off the ship. And it was almost like a veiled threat, or at least that's how I interpreted it. But like that kind of seems like to apply to this as well. It's like these companies going to see the writing on the wall and they'd rather be on the side of this system versus trying to counter it. Now, is that too conspiratorial, or do you buy that?
I think that it's partly that they see the writing on the wall. They know this is the direction things are moving, and they want to be on the right side of history as they understand it. But I also think that there is a real incentive for these people personally as well, because you got to think about this from their perspective, right? Right now, their primary concern is profit, right? That's their primary concern of most major corporations. That's how the big CEOs get paid. It's usually based on profits. The shareholders care about profits. It's all about profits. It's about efficiency. It's about building your business and making good economic decisions and finding new products and research and development and all of that stuff. Wouldn't it be so much easier if you could just have some crony deal where as long as you're woke enough, some government's going to give you lots of money and you don't have to worry about being profitable. You just got to be woke enough, and that's good enough for everyone. That it actually makes it easier for them. Right. Because all you have to do is check off all the little left-wing boxes and you get the big, gigantic stimulus package money. And that's all that it takes. Yeah. Profits become secondary. Yeah, profits are fine. That's good. You want to be profitable, but so long as you're woke. If you're not woke, then being profitable is a bad thing. It means you're a greedy, evil corporation who's destroying the planet. But if you are woke, profit doesn't matter that much. Your life as a big corporate, CEO is actually better because all you got to do is make sure you're in good with Klaus Schwab and George Soros and Joe Biden and John Kerry and all those people, and they'll take care of you. Don't worry about it. Yeah. So I actually see it's a form of cronyism here. There's a real financial incentive for these people too to be involved in this.
Yeah. Okay. Good point. All right, Isaac, we want to talk about this 8 predictions for the world of 2030. So this is kind of, I don't know if this would relate specifically to the Great Reset. It's a little tangential, but it is a World Economic Forum article here. And it
just demonstrates how stupid these people are.
Well, okay, so I only really wanted to talk about the first prediction, which I actually think is a pretty scary one. So the first prediction is the idea that, like, in the future, we won't own anything. All products will have become services. Quote, I don't own anything. I don't own a car. I don't own a house. I don't own any appliances or any clothes, writes Danish MP Ida Akun. Shopping is a distant memory in the city of 2030, whose inhabitants have cracked clean energy and borrow what they need on demand. It sounds utopian until she mentions that her every move is tracked, and outside the city live swaths of discontents and the ultimate depiction, that's Jim, the ultimate depiction of a society split in two. So this is an article that was just like they talked to a bunch of experts that wanted to have a vision of what the future would look like, and these are like their 8 predictions. So that first one to me, which they've actually promoted as like seemingly being something that they're in favor of in some of their social media content, is this idea of like basically the elimination of private property. I think that's what it boils down to. You don't own a car, you don't own your house, you just pay rent, you just pay for an Uber. I mean,
as a landlord, I'm in favor of that, but who owns the building, right?
Yeah, not you. I think the landlord class is gone.
We get mowed.
It's some big. Well, no, it's probably some big gigantic corporation. It's
they make it so
everything.
impossible for mom and pop stuff to operate. They shut them down, and then all the market share gets eaten up by the big companies. And
Isaac, I bet you have a failing ESG score. If I had to guess.
I am proud of how negative my ESG score is. Sometimes I just turn the water on and let it run.
You're not gonna be glad that you spent all that time on those forums where you're talking about the landed class or whatever. When the ESG police come for you and they want to know why you're making fun of all of the tenants.
But to me, honestly, this is like an absolutely terrifying prediction. So back I don't know, a year ago, I complained about the digital media going by the wayside and how we only have streaming services now, because now those streaming services are subjected to just whatever the woke cause of the day is. And if there's now some content is deemed offensive, we just don't have it anymore. It's been disappeared down the memory hole. Now you can't stream it forever, right? They can't come and take your DVDs, but they can make sure that you can't watch those movies when it comes to Netflix or HBO Max or something like that. But now apply that to everything, okay? Because now it's not like the government is mandating that they get rid of that content. It's these services that are doing it. So how about when nobody owns their own houses? The government can't tell you that you can't own guns, but maybe this mega corporation that everyone's paying rent to live in these homes tells you can't own guns in their properties. It just seems like this is opens the door to an end around of any restrictions that we have on the government.
This is where the Great Reset version of capitalism turns into this dystopia that is predicted in 2030. There's one prediction that is absolutely certain for 2030, and that is that we will all be less free. I think even if we're fighting back on the Great Reset, we will all still be less free in many ways. But one of the virtues of capitalism is that it is predicated on choice, on freedom of choice of customers and companies to do what they need to do to satisfy the most people as possible so that they are profitable. Profits are a good thing. Profits are proof that you are serving the people better than any bureaucrat could ever devise. And so if we do end up in a place where most people are not owning their homes, or they don't own their car and all that thing even said you don't even own your own clothes. That's going to be fun. But if we get to that place by choice, that's one thing. If we get to that place because we basically have fascism by its classical definition, government-controlled corporations providing services for you basically against your will because you don't have the market forces have been removed and been replaced by government diktat. That is not capitalism in any sense. That is what, again, that's the classic definition of fascism. So, the fact that we are going to a more service economy is a good thing because people are choosing it. It is a bad thing when you have no choices left, and that's all that remains because government has made it so.
Well, and I think that there's another element to this too that people need to realize is that capitalism provide the fact that you can actually own property. That's the primary way that you amass wealth over the course of your life. What this does, if you're not owning your own house ever, but you're just renting always, then what it does is it puts you in a position where you're not ever really building any wealth. Sure. The wealth that you get simply is the money you need to spend in order to survive. And so what ends up happening is anytime you find yourself in a difficult financial situation, your first, and we've seen this already happen where people don't save money anymore. They used to save money. They don't save money anymore. If you don't save money and you don't have your own home and you don't have your own car and you don't have anything because everything you do is through some service, then you don't really have any wealth. And you are at the whims if you're just working all the time, then maybe that works okay in your day-to-day life, but you're at the whims of, in an economic downturn, of whatever the government is willing to give you. You're not actually building any wealth for yourself. You're not actually leaving anything behind for your children. Everyone just becomes dependent on on government when things go really poorly, which is what we've seen happen. And so it's a way for people to build wealth over time that gets totally and completely destroyed. And it also allows you to have control over it. As Donnie was saying, if you're owning the wealth, if you own your house, you have control over that. But if you don't own it, you don't have control over it. Not really. And you don't ever really get to decide what goes on in your house if you can have some big gigantic corporation say you can't smoke cigarettes in the building because cigarette smoke is bad. You can't have guns in the building because guns are bad. You can't do XYZ things because that will lower our ESG score. And we don't want that. So there's all sorts of problems that are inherent in that kind of a model. And yet that's what the World Economic Forum wants, right? Because they're the ones who already have the wealth. And so it's easy for them in that world, but it's hard for people like us who don't have that kind of wealth.
Yeah. And it's easier for a government or some centralized bureaucracy to manage a handful of giant corporations than billions of people. So, all right. Well, that will do it for this episode. If you want to learn more about the Great Reset, like I said, we've been covering this for a while. Go to stoppingsocialism.com. You can find a ton of content about this on there. But if you like our show, you can subscribe, write a review for us on iTunes. It'd be greatly appreciated. Join us every Friday for a new episode of In the Tank Podcast. You can find us on SoundCloud, Stitcher, Google Play, YouTube, pretty much everything nowadays. If you'd like, you can follow us on Socialist Twitter at In the Tank Pod. If you have any comments, suggestions, questions, feel free to email us at inthetankpodcast@gmail.com. Justin, where can the fine people find you?
They can find me on Parler at Justin T. Haskins. Look for that shiny, beautiful gold badge on Parler. God. Or you could go to Socialist Twitter and look for that big, beautiful blue check mark. We're still there.
Jim Lakely, same question.
At J Lakely on Twitter, at Heartland Inst on Twitter. Always go to heartland.org. And you are still a free man and a free woman. Resist.
That's right. Isaac Orr, where can the fine people find you?
Nowhere.
He's going off the grid.
Yeah, underneath some holes, underneath the Parliament building in London or whatever.
I am not at liberty to discuss that.
All right. Thank you all for tuning in. We will talk to you next week.